Trauma Therapist Podcast Plus listeners can listen to episodes early and ad-free right now. Become a Plus listener by going to Apple Podcasts, searching for the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and signing up today. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, a show about the incredible people dedicated to helping those who have experienced trauma. My name is Guy McPherson, and my mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to inspire each of us to help those around us. Neal, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Neal King. Neal, welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So Dr. King has served as a psychologist, psychotherapist, professor of psychology, author, keynote speaker, and college president in his professional life. And he's worked with multiple survivors of trauma in his clinical practice. In his book, Trauma is a Thief, he applies the same case study methodology he used in his dissertation at UC Berkeley to his own lived experience in a deeply disturbed family. Neal is recognized for his contributions to the LGBTQ community and general population trauma issues through his research and clinical work. He focuses on the psychological impacts of trauma, again, both to the LGBTQ community and more broadly, including the effects of discrimination, violence, and marginalization. Neal, welcome to the podcast. Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I'll do it backwards. I'm currently in Southern California, where I grew up mostly. I'm a military brat, so we moved around quite a bit. I was born in Florida. I've lived most of my life in Northern and Southern California, so I would say I'm from California.
Okay. So really interesting background. Professor, keynote speaker, college president, a lot of different stuff here. This first question here. How did this, and when I say this, this journey to this book, how did this start? How did this begin for you?
Well, it began with the trauma in the family. My father was a very disturbed human being, and because we moved around a lot, and because of the time, I'm 78, so I come from a generation where there wasn't the public awareness today that there is of sexual abuse, disturbed families, alcoholism, all of that. We lived in the family was a very closed unit. I had the role of the hero, the guy who went out to the world and kind of communicated that this family's okay. There's some normalcy here. And, the reinforcement I got in that role, I think, built over time such that it surprised me when my friends in high school decided I should be student body president. I said, "Oh, really? Why? You know, how did that happen?" And so I got reinforcement for being in the role of the public guy, the speaker, the likable enough guy, the charming enough guy. And then I found that I have a facility with words, and both spoken and written. And so those things began to kind of come together. Eventually, it became clear to me that I was really scarred by my early life, and that if I was going to have any fullness of life as an adult, I had some work to do. And I kind of took an off-road from my path. A lot of people thought I would go into law and politics. I instead went into education, and then eventually into psychology, did a variety of different therapies. And it was only after my sister died about 7 years ago that I decided that in her memory, my brother's memory, for people who can't find or don't have a voice to attempt to extricate from their own trauma, I would put it all down in words and see if it could be helpful to other people. It was very cathartic for me, see if it could be helpful to other people as well.
So just at the outset, you know, if I ask you something, you don't want to talk about it, that's perfectly fine. Just say, I don't want to go there, whatever. So you were abused.
Yeah.
Were you abused by your father? Okay.
I was physically abused by my father, yes.
Okay. If we take a step back, how did you said you played the hero role. How did you deal with it? In other way, was that the only way you dealt with it? Was that one way you dealt with it? How did you manage that?
Yeah, it was very lonely. A thing that I realized really writing the book is I described. I'll talk about two incidents that I think make the point. Um, my father was a naval officer, and at one point, after he'd been overseas for a while, invited me to spend time with him on his ship. He was in command of 5 different ships at the time, and he laid me out in his bunk in his cabin and masturbated me. It was my first orgasm. I was 12. I had no idea what was going on. 5 minutes later, we were sitting in the officer's stateroom having lunch, and he was being the commanding officer. And I was like, what the fuck just happened? And so part of how I dealt with that is I just stuffed it. It's like I was in shock. I had no idea what to do. I had nobody I could talk with it about it. Another
How old were
incident,
you? I'm sorry. How old were you at that
12,
time?
12.
12. Okay.
Another incident, sometime when I was in high school, probably within 2 or 3 years of that time, my father and I were alone in the house, and he was chasing me around with an obvious erection in his pants. And I was determined, oh no, this is not going to happen. And so I got out of the house and I stayed out until somebody else came back. And then I came back into the house, and we both acted as if nothing had happened. And we sat at dinner that night. He was on my left, my sister was on my right, and I was just seething internally. So how did I deal with it? I stuffed it. I internalized it. I hid it away someplace where it became a dissociated, a split off part of myself. And that's where it lived until I was able to give it voice, access it, understand it. But I had to get some distance to do that.
And you mentioned siblings. So this was this going on with the siblings, your siblings as well?
He abused my brother, my older brother, in a one rare moment of candor. He said to me, "Your brother got the worst of it." My sister, I think more his sexism. He ridiculed her for having breasts, for being a girl. Basically said she didn't have to go to college because she was just going to get married and have kids. So she got sort of residual. I mean, the guy was just so toxic. She got more of the residual toxicity. My brother and I got the full brunt of it.
Therapy at all? Did you go into that? Did you tell anyone? Any friends? What was going on?
Um, the first person I told was I was a college student, and he was a member of the faculty. He was a monk. This was at a Catholic college, and he was a psychologist. And in the terms of our friendship, it wasn't a therapeutic relationship, but I confided in him. He confided that he had gone into the ministry in some ways to escape his own sexuality. So that was my first telling anybody. I didn't really enter into any psychotherapy until I became a graduate student in my mid to late 20s. So it was just something I lived with all through. And I talk about it in the book, a very confusing mix of what was the reaction to the abuse, what was my sexual orientation. It really messed up my psychosexual development in terms of any kind of chronologically appropriate development of a sexual identity.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's just so horrific and so intense. And, we talk about compartmentalization, dissociation, and stuffing things down. Um, but it has to come out some way, right? It's got to
Right.
come out in some manifestation. It comes out, and in varying degrees. You talked about psychosocial, psychosexual development. Were you aware in how this was impacting you?
No,
And yes, you were. No, okay.
no. So I talk about in the book as well that I've done quite a deep dive into human sexuality, sexual orientation. Of course, like a lot of gay people who are abused, the temptation is to say, well, I'm gay because I was abused. So that's simply not true. There's absolutely no evidence supporting that there's a connection. There'd be a lot more gay men if it was true. So it's simply not true. But in doing the dive, I had to spend a lot of time differentiating between what was residue of the abuse, which tended to be hypersexuality, depression, escape, my 12-step friends later in life would say you spend a lot of time doing geographics, getting, changing, getting out of the situation. And I did, it's true. I learned that escaping physically, mentally, psychologically, dissociatively, those were ways that I was able to survive. But I didn't get insight into that until I entered into my really significant therapies, which were when I was a doctoral student in my 30s. So.
What inspired you to pursue psychology?
I mentioned this in the book as well, that I was interested from the beginning. I wanted to be a psychology major as an undergraduate, and I took the first psychology course I took. The course, again, I was living with a hypersexualized reality. The professor said, okay, I want you to all take out a piece of paper and draw the human figure. And he was walking around looking over our shoulders, and I thought, he's looking inside of me. He's going to see something that I don't know that I want anybody to see, kind of thing. And so I changed my major. I became an English major. And it wasn't until years later, after I'd been a high school counselor, been around the world, been a teacher, I was working with adolescents at the American School in London. And I had my BA in English, but that was it. Had no formal training. But I was really working closely with them and their families, more psychologically than just in a superficial counseling kind of way. And I said to myself, for a number of reasons, it's time to go back to school and develop this gift that I seem to have in terms of working and interacting with people, but also to challenge myself and to finally make the investment of getting underneath all this stuff. So,
How old were you at that time?
33.
It's it's really interesting when we get, I mean, my experience when, as someone who, you get to a certain age, and if there are things in your life that you don't look at or don't want to look at, and then get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm ready to look at this. That can be a huge moment. What was that? Sounds like you had a revelation or realization or a moment. Was there energy there? Was there a decision like, I want to help other people? And maybe we're getting into the impetus for the book, but talk a little bit about that, if you would.
It's a great question, and I would say there are several parts to it. One, I started a master's program in my 20s in counseling, and it was kind of a variation on the being observed, drawing the human figure. I thought, there's so much inside of me that isn't resolved. I'm not like, in your group therapy class I wasn't prepared to talk about the mess that was inside of me. I didn't know how to find words for it. I was so afraid of being judged. I was so full of shame. So I stopped the program and I did other things. I call it my bohemian period in the book. I really traveled around the world. I did a lot of LSD. I learned kind of meditation that became very important to me. I developed a relationship with silence. So there are a lot of self therapies. But the impetus was really working with the kids at the American school and thinking, people seem to trust me. People seem to want me to engage with them. I think my instincts are good, but I need more training. And then I think maybe I wasn't even fully conscious that I also needed a lot of work of my own, and it needed to be more formally done than what I'd been doing sort of on my own. And I engaged with a number of different psychotherapists, including Jungian analysts, through the period that I was in graduate school. And it was, again, I talk about it in the book, it was transformative. I came out a different person in terms of awareness, integration, awareness of what was happening inside of me.
Let's talk about the book. Again, I'm speaking with Dr. Neal King. The book is Trauma is a Thief. At what point did you say to yourself, I'm going to write this. I need to write it, perhaps? How did that come about?
Yeah, it was one of those things that felt like it had to be told, a story that had to be told, a book that had to be written. And it was about a 10-year process. So and I went through all kinds of, I was going to make it primarily genealogical, and then I was going to give it right in the third person and create a character. I was just it took so long to like say, no, this has to be my story and my voice, and it has to all be told. And so I talk about my secret life. I just feel like I just got to kind of get it all out there. And the intent is that I know that a lot of trauma survivors live with buried in shame and paralyzed by shame, and that underneath that shame, there are a lot of secrets. There's a lot of stuff that they've never been able to resolve. My older brother drank himself to death. That was a huge motivation at 47. That's how he dealt with his trauma. Um, there was the determination, a 10-year process. Once I got clarity on it, it was written in about a year. But it took me a long time. And again, I'm the only one now surviving from my nuclear family. My younger sister, who was very dear to me, her death and her struggles with addiction were huge motivators as well to live, to thrive for myself and for others, and to find words.
It takes a lot of guts to do that. I mean, I think it takes a lot of courage to get to a point where not only do you say you're going to write it, but you're not going to write it in the third person. You're not going to create some character. You're putting yourself on the line. I mean, what was that like for you? Or were you just at a point where like, fuck it, I need to do this. I don't care what.
Yeah, it was, what was it like? It was enormously liberating, but I reached, again, I'm 78. I see 80 on the horizon. I've been retired for a while. And I did kind of like reach a fuck it point. I don't care what people think. I have neighbors who've read the book, and some of them will talk about it with me. Others, they don't want to talk about it. Okay, I don't care. But I just feel like I had to be at that point where my own healing, my own process required me to just kind of like come clean. And the final leap was the fuck it, I don't care.
Now, you talked about obviously your dad. Where was your mom in this whole picture?
Yeah, that's kind of the sad story in a way. She was a good lady. She and my dad married when she was 18 and he was 24. And they met through her older brother, who was a sailor, who my father, I believe, fell in love with, boyish, several years younger. So I think in a twisted kind of way, my father wanted to marry my mother as a way of being close to her brother. And so it was off to a lousy start to begin with. And then, she was a Navy wife and she had 3 kids before she was 25. And she dropped out of school to get married to this guy. And they were both very attractive young people. So it wasn't as if on the outside he was an unattractive guy. So she became severely depressed. She drank heavily. She died at 53 from a combination of her alcoholism and her cancers. And she was a very unhappy human being most of her adult life.
Was she aware of what was going on?
She has to have been. There wasn't very much acknowledgement. I think she tried leaving him a couple times. I think she was so immersed in her own survival that she didn't really have much energy for the kids. She would send me to the grocery store where I worked as a box boy. This was so embarrassing in high school, with a note to the guy in the liquor department to sell me a bottle of vodka for her and bring it home so she wouldn't have to go in herself. And there had to have been levels of awareness. My father once brought home a hitchhiker and in front of her begged him to stay with her, a teenage boy. And she moved out for a few days. He was a pedophile, some kid he was enamored of. She moved out for a few days and realized she didn't really have any options. So she moved back and drank more. I mean, so it was she's a tragic character in the story.
Was there, and forgive me if this seems like a naive question or maybe even an insensitive question, but you had a brother. Was there ever, did you guys talk about what was going on? Was there ever like, let's jump him and, get him, let's fight him? Was there any of that?
No, today, I think he would be on the autism spectrum. He was an extremely bright guy. He was an engineer. He he flunked out of UCLA for trying to forge his grades because all he wanted to do was play bridge. So he got kicked out of UCLA, and then he went in the Navy. They tested him. He went through their nuclear reactor school. Then they brought him back to teach in the nuclear reactor school. So, he was just a super bright guy, but he was so socially awkward. And as adults, I one time said to him, we were leaving, one of the rare times, we were such different people. Unfortunately, we were never friends. And I said to him, I said, Dad molested me as a kid. He did you too, didn't he? And he just got this horrified look on his face and turned around and walked away. So that was as close as we ever came to having a conversation.
So you sit down at some point, you're like, I need to write this book. Fuck it, I've got to get it out there. What was your goal? What was the thing you needed to get out there and for whom?
Yeah, I think it had several stages. One was I just needed to write it and then and I didn't have a lot of confidence because, I don't know if you're a writer, but sometimes you're so close to it that you're not sure what clarity you have. So I sent a draft to Janet Goldstein, who I mentioned in the book. She was my editor for a book that I did on male survivors of childhood sexual abuse in '95. And she's an excellent editor, no bullshit. She's not going to try to be your friend. And I said, is there a there? What do you think? And she gave me a 5 out of 10. She gave me a lot of suggestions on structure, on voice. She was as unsparing as I knew she would be. But I came away from the interaction with her thinking there is a there. So I'm going to polish it. I'm going to, take her suggestions to heart. And then I'm going to see if I can find somebody who would want to publish it. And that was a whole process in itself. I knew that the major publishers don't publish memoirs of non-famous people. And I consider this to be only partly a memoir, but also sort of partly the case study thing of the objective being to be helpful to others. But my ultimate intent was to get it into the hands of people who have had similar experience and who could benefit from reading it. People who love them. I think those of us who survive trauma are mysterious to our loved ones a lot of the time, and people who want to love us but don't know how. And then also people who treat and study survivors of trauma. I'm hoping that it lands in some of those hands and is helpful.
Well, obviously we have a lot of those listening. How might that help them? What do you think they would get out of it specifically?
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, I chose to emphasize my lived experience. I thought, okay, I'm a psychologist. I've been on the expert side of this. I've conducted research. I've written about this. I think what I have to contribute is I can also draw back the curtain and talk about having lived it and having, and using myself as a case study and talking about, I mentioned I'm kind of my in-house ethnographer. I'm walking people through the experience of living in that really messed up family, as a psychologist, as a researcher, as a writer, as an adult who's had a lot of time to reflect on that. I don't think that perspective, I haven't run into it before. So I think that a lot of times, and I think I did this myself for years, you can hide behind the research, you can hide behind the clinical role, you can hide behind the expertise. But I wanted to unmask, the behind all of that, having myself had to struggle to survive, let alone to be in any measure successful. I just wanted to put that out there as something that perhaps is a different kind of contribution. That's my hope.
Mm-hmm. How did you structure the book?
I decided that I did a lot of genealogical research, looking for context. And so I started with context and the background going back generations. My mother's family initially came over on the Mayflower, so they were here 2 centuries before my father's, who escaped famine in Ireland. The English had subjugated the Irish for 8 centuries. As soon as the English got here, they wiped out the native populations on Cape Cod. So I was trying to, I suspected and found to be true that trauma sort of lived across the generations in my family story. And that, and I tried looking for the roots of my father's pathologies. And I think that the generational stuff was a part of that. So I started there. Then I started talking about my father's early life, my mother's early life, their meeting, and contributing factors there. They came from working class families. Nobody had any money. They had to struggle. They bought their first house when I was 9 for $15,000 in LA. That was a huge, plop. Here you are in the middle class post World War II. So then I talk about our early years as a family. And I talk about each of us, my brother, my sister, the family interactions, school, which was a lifeline for me at every level, and then escape. When I just had to get out of there. I graduated high school here in LA or Southern California, a little bit north of where I am right now, and my parents wanted me to stay in Southern California. My dad said, "I'll buy you any car you want if you stay here and go to school here." I said, "I don't need a car. I'm out of here." I was 17. I thought I wanted to be a priest. I initially went to seminary briefly. So I talk about escaping college, my brief stay in the seminary, what begins to happen as I differentiate, as I have some opportunity to be off on my own. And then I go into the Bohemian period, kind of like the way I describe it is my trauma just sort of thrust me out into the world without a plan. But somehow that was what I had to follow in order to escape, in order to get underneath it all.
When you started seeing a therapist, was it because of you wanted to deal with this, or was it for a different reason?
No, it was primarily because I wanted to deal with this. And I found
Okay.
therapists to be very divergent in terms of their ability to
Yeah.
understand it, absorb it, be helpful.
Yeah. Now, was there someone who really helped you? And if so, what did they do?
Um, there are a couple of people who I think were not helpful, and a couple of people who I think were very helpful. The couple of people who were very helpful happened both to be Jungian analysts. One was an older woman who was retired. She worked in her home, and you could only work with her if her dog liked you and would let you into the house. And she was absolutely great. And she was empathic. She was non-judgmental. You could go as deep with her as you were able to, and she was right there with you. And another was a guy, psychiatrist who practiced in San Francisco, also a Jungian analyst, and we did a lot of dream work. And he was very empowering around. I mentioned that in my secret life, I frequented young male escorts, and he was very empowering around the value of that to my healing process and to my integration process. So.
When you look at, if we take a step back and you look at where we are now with the therapeutic culture, I mean, there are a lot of trauma modalities out there. Trauma certainly is more in the news, right? We have more language for talking about it, and certainly there's a greater acceptance than when you and I were both young. What do you see now that is helpful in all of this? What do you see now that maybe you wish you had access to as a young kid?
Yeah, so a couple of reactions there. One, having written the book and now, trying to get the word out about its existence, I feel like I've discovered that trauma is an industry of sorts, and it's and there are superstars, and there are people really who are able to capitalize on it in a certain way, which I don't really want to do. I don't think that's my place or the gig that I'm looking for. And trauma itself, as you know, I mean, I can't imagine the range of what you hear in the process of doing your show, but trauma itself is vast. And there's so many aspects of trauma. There's so many instances of trauma. There's so many variations on the theme. So I guess one thing is that I think there's a gigantic validation of the existence of trauma. I didn't have that word in my vocabulary as a young person, and I didn't know that that was what was happening to me. So the existence of it, the effects of it, I think there's a lot of PTSD alone, the knowledge of that that's a condition, I think has been extremely valuable. And then, various, my work with childhood sexual abuse survivors was a narrow sort of universe of trauma. And I realized when I came to write this book that it was too narrow for me. I needed to broaden the context and talk about trauma more broadly.
Why?
Because the sexual abuse doesn't tell the whole story. It existed. It existed in a context, and it was. It had the sexual abuse had cousins in the trauma universe that I lived in, and they all, they were threads of the same tapestry, or whatever. To understand the trauma, they had to all be digested and understood.
And then finally, the title, Trauma is a Thief. I mean, one can imagine what you mean by that, but what it was your intention with the title?
I think the essence of what I wanted the title to do was to explain that trauma does in fact rob you of some essential parts of yourself, and you don't ever get them back fully. I don't believe you can ever erase it. So, but I think you can do a lot of work in recovery and take it back and recover from it. So I wanted to just validate my own experience and the experience of others that yes, that is what happens. That is what has happened, is that trauma is a thief. It steals from you, and you're never going to get it all back.
The book is called Trauma is a Thief. We'll have it linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Neal, what is the best way for people to learn more about you and learn more about the book, etc.?
So the book is available on Amazon. I am on LinkedIn as Neal King. I don't have a separate web page, but there's my bio is there, and at the back of the book, my email address is there, nkingphd@gmail.com. People are welcome to contact me. I am no longer doing psychotherapy. I do have a small consulting practice where I focus on life transitions, but I'm not. My license is inactive as a psychologist in California by choice. So I feel like I'm more valuable as a writer and as a consultant. But if people want to find me, there are ways to do that, and they're welcome to do that.
Awesome. I appreciate you coming on this podcast again. I admire what you've done. I think it takes a huge amount of courage to do what you did. So I appreciate it. Appreciate you coming on here, and love to have you back.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Enjoyed the time talking with you.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.